All right, hello again. So in this video, I'm going to walk through an example of how you might design and use functions when you're trying to create a computer program, a simple computer program. The goal here is to try to show you and sort of walk through what the thought process is and how you can sort of go about building these kinds of programs using just the skills that we have already. This is the kind of thing you'll use in some of your practice and assignments for this module. So what we're going to build today is we're going to sort of go through an example and make a really sort of basic calculator that acts a little bit sort of like an old 10 key you might use in like an accounting type thing. Basically what it's going to do is it's going to let us input an initial starting value, say in whatever units we want, and then we're going to be able to specify a bunch of math operations that we can do. So we can say add numbers, subtract numbers, add more numbers, multiply, divide, any kind of things we want to do. And then in the end, then it'll basically keep a sort of a running total and then give us a final value at the end of the application. I apologize in advance for the math-heavy nature of this example. It's not complex math though; it's addition, and there's a bunch of other stuff that's going to go on here as well. So we're going to be developing this as a command line application because we want this to both be an application, something that we actually run, right? It's not just a Jupyter notebook that does some work, and because I want to show you an example of how to develop and debug this on the command line, which ends up being a little bit different than the Jupyter debugging that we sort of showed off a little bit earlier. But the same ideas about how we're going to organize things into functions and how we're going to combine multiple functions together are going to apply even if you're working inside of Jupyter instead. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to close off the screenshot. So what I've got here, sort of just to give you a sense for what our window looks like, is I've got my script file here open in Visual Studio Code. This is going to be in a file called 10key.py because we're making a 10-key calculator. I've gotten a sort of note to say we're going to write some functions up here at the top, and I've got an if name is equal to main block that we'll be able to actually call that code when our function gets run. I also have my terminal open so that I can go ahead and run python 10key.py in order to actually execute this file and see what happens. So at the moment, if I run that code, nothing happens because there literally is no code. There's nothing for us to do yet. All right, cool. So that's what we're going to try to do. So if we go back to, I should not have closed that window. Okay, fine. But if we go back to sort of what our function is supposed to do, the first thing that our program will need to do is we want to get this kind of initial value, right? So we want to be able to do that kind of work. So we could write some code to do that. So for example, and again, if you recall from the previous video, if we want to be able to get some input, we would be able to just say input an initial value, right? That's the thing that I want to get. And we'll be able to get that input and then say save that response inside a variable. And that's the kind of thing we could just do in writing code. However, but because we might want to do some extra work around getting that input, like maybe we want to convert it, we're going to want to convert it into a number, maybe we want to do some other kinds of processing, it's a really good idea to build that up into its own function. So rather than just having the code sort of sitting here in our script to be run whenever we execute the script, we'd like to be able to put that in a function, have the function do that work instead. So what we're going to do is we can make ourselves a new function. We're going to define a getInitialValue function because that's what the function does. So I'm going to name it after the entire purpose of this function. I don't need any arguments, right? There's no extra information that I need to know in order to get some of its initial value. So I'll just go ahead and put that there. We'll be able to then go ahead and get our response. So I'm going to move that line of code up. And then because we know that we want this to be then a floating value, we could also go ahead and take whatever that input is and make a float version of it, right? We want to convert it from a string into a number. I could convert it into an int, but I'm going to make sure we can work with floats because if the ideas we're going to eventually work with, like if this is ideas this would be used for like balancing your checkbook, you'd want to be able to handle decimals because they're decimal values in money. So in any case, we're going to get that value in order to get our response. And then the really important part here is we want to make sure then to return whatever that response is, right? We want to return that. Here we'll rename this. It calls value, right? Because this is what we're getting. Is we want to make sure to return this value so that when we call this function down here, when we call getInitialValue, I can then actually be able to get that value and be able to then use it later. So for example, I would then be able to print out, right, the initial value is whatever this value happens to be. So again, the idea here is we've got a function that's going to return a value so that I can be able to use that later in sort of doing the further calculation work. If I go back to my terminal now, I can execute my code again, and you'll see that now it prompts me for my initial value. I can put in 3, and then it tells me my initial value is 3.0, which means it looks like everything's working. We're sort of good to go here. So at this point, we might say like, okay, great, that's good, but maybe like I'm going to imagine I'm going to be typing these things in a lot. One of these sort of error types checking we might want to consider is like what happens if I might put in sort of not great input. We're not going to deal with handling like non-numeric input at the moment because that just goes beyond the scope of what we're interested in. But what we could do is say like, well, what happens if I just hit enter, right? So I'm just going to, I mean, you can't see, but I'm just going to hit the enter key without putting in a value. What happened was we got an error on our command line, right? Oh God, it's this traceback thing going on again. If we look down the bottom, it says value error, could not convert string to float. And so the idea was that when I typed in my input and I got myself this string, it tried to then make that into a float, but it couldn't actually do that. So we're not able to figure out what's actually happening there. So part of the creation is like, well, what string did we even get? It's a little bit hard to sort of see and debug this on the command line, but the idea is the string that we actually got. So if I'm going to pull out this floating part here because we don't need that anymore. So if I, oh my God, I'm going to go back to my response idea, right? So if I go back to this response, then what the response that we actually got is what's called the empty string. So it's basically going to be a string, right? It's going to be some text, but it has absolutely no letters inside of it. So it's not even just a space. It's not even just the letter A. It's literally a string that has nothing inside of it. So this is what's called an empty string value. So what I would then want to do, because I want to make sure that if they type in an empty string, I don't want to then try to convert that response into a float. So what I'm going to want to do instead is maybe use something like an if statement to make sure that if they type in an empty string, right, if they just hit enter, that I'm doing something else instead. So I could do that. I might say that if my response is going to be an empty string, right? I'm going to use my equal symbol. So saying if the thing they typed in was just nothing, they just hit enter, then what I would like to do is I still need to return a value, right? I mean, getting this value needs to provide a number, but maybe we'll say, okay, how about the value that we're going to give back is 0. So if they just hit enter, then we'll say, great, cool, you didn't specify initial value, we'll default to 0 and we'll be good to go from there. We can then have an else, right? And otherwise, we can then say, take that response, which is the thing that they had typed in, and I say, well, now I know that if you didn't type in an empty string, then you should be able to convert that into a float, which will then let me be able to, which I can then convert. So I can convert that into a float by, again, saying take that response and make it into a float, and then I'll take that whole value and return it to be able to be used later. So I'm going to then, I can go back to my code. I'm going to test this again. So now it asks me for initial value. If I type in a number like 3.5, that worked okay. If I type it, here, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to just move this up. Now you should be able to see better. If I just hit enter without typing anything, then it tells me my initial value is 0, which means it looks like we're good to go, so we're still moving. So now hopefully you can be able to see a little bit why it was not a bad idea. It was a good idea to be able to put this input thing, what looked like it was going to just be one line of code, we put it into this other function because that way when we wanted to add more complexity, when we wanted to make it do more interesting things, we're able to build that out so that now my code down here still looks pretty simple, right? I'm just saying get the initial value, but all the details involved in what's involved in getting that initial value has all been specified up here at the top in sort of this other separate function that we're able to use over and elsewhere and doing other things. All right, great. So we got that piece done, our initial value. So now the next step of our interaction, if we go back to sort of remembering what we were trying to do from the beginning of the video, and I closed the screenshot so I can actually show it, is that we want to have the user be able to type in a command. For example, we want to be able to have the user type in something that looks like add 3, and we want to be able to take that command, right, add, and use that to do some math on sort of whatever our current initial value is. This feels like this might end up being two different problems that I'm going to be dealing with, is that we're going to have to deal with sort of the getting the command part and figuring out what do they want us to do. They want us to add or subtract. And then we're also going to have to deal with the actually like doing the math part, right? How would I actually add these numbers together? So it feels like I might need to make multiple functions to handle this kind of work, but we're going to at least start small and sort of build out. And then if we feel like we need to start breaking things up into different functions or into different pieces, we can do that as we go. All right, so let's keep going. So the idea here is we want to have some kind of function that's going to let us be able to do this like add 3 operation, do this math thing. So I'm going to find a function that does that work. So we're going to call this function do operation because we're going to do a mathematical operation. There's probably lots of other names we could have given it, but this is the version I'm going with because it made sense when I wrote the example, and I'm going to just stick with that because it's all in the same place. So if we do some operation, we're going to think through what kinds of inputs are we going to want to deal with. Well, we know that we've already gotten an initial value from this other function. So if we do an operation, we're probably going to want to know what our current value actually is, right? So if we say, if the user types in add 3, we need to know what number we're adding that 3 to. So we're going to need to have some kind of argument that's going to let us know that when we say do operation, we need to know, well, what are we doing that operation to? What number do we already have? So let's give ourselves an argument, and we'll call our argument a current value. So we'll be able to keep track of what is the thing that has already been typed in, or rather, we'll be able to pass in what are the sort of the current running total. We can then do an operation to that, right? So we're then going to say after that we're going to then do some math. I'm just going to put a quick note to myself here, and then in the end we're going to want to return a value, right? We're going to want to return sort of the new value. Right, this is what I want to do in the end. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to effectively create sort of a skeleton, an outline of what my program might look like. So I know that I want to be able to do an operation, I want to take in some value, and I know I'm going to do some work to it, and then I'm going to be able to return that new value. Once I got that, what that means I'll be able to do is that in sort of my block of code down here, I'll be able to say get my initial value. I'm then going to be able to say call do operation, passing in that initial value, right? This is going to pass in the initial value. And then I know that do operation is going to return something, so then I can eventually have the result of calling my do operation function, and then I'd be able to say print out that result, and the way I was going to print it was as like, let me check my notes real fast. I was printing this, I don't know. We're going to print it out as like final value, and we can then print out what that result might be. So the idea here is that I'm basically going to be able to say, take this value I got from initial value, pass it into do operation, which gives me another result, and I can take that result and use that later. I'm basically creating this sort of chain of methods, of functions, one function that produces a result that goes into the next function, that produces a result that goes into the next function, and that way I'm able to build out all the work that I want to do, sort of this pipeline of interaction, while having each piece be sort of isolated into its own individual component. Right, so that I have my get initial value, that's all set, I don't need to worry about that anymore, and now I can just focus on this, how do I do this operation work? Great. Okay, so let's begin filling in this do operation work. So there's a couple of things that we're going to need to do, right? And I'm going to try writing this out in what is known as pseudocode, right? This is known as pseudocode, right? It's sort of going to write as fake code. I'm not actually going to write out the code. No, I'm going to sort of try to write out the instructions on what I want to do in order to basically give myself, again, kind of a pathway through writing this program. So I know what I'm going to want to be able to do first is I'm going to want to be able to say get input from user, right? I'm then going to say I'm going to say figure out to say like what's the next step? I'm going to be able to then figure out what decide what command to do, right? I need to then do that math to get my new value. Rather to produce new value, and then I'll be able to return my new value. So those are sort of the steps involved that we have to do in order to do one of these operations. Okay, great. So we can go ahead and start getting this kind of information. So I need get input from user. Well, that's okay. We've done that before. That's not too bad. So let's get our response will be from calling input. I'm going to use a really basic, just like angle bracket for the prompt because it seems faster. We're going to be doing this a lot. So I'll just do sort of prompt. Cool. So we got there as a response. Great. We got our input from the user. Life is good. So then the question is we need to then do the next sort of step, which we need to decide what command we want to do. So remember that what this response is going to look like is this is going to look like add 3, which means that this response, the text they typed in, actually has two different parts. One part is the command add, and one part is the value, the 3, the thing that we actually want to add. So we need to figure out how to basically break those apart. I need to figure out how can I get just the word add in order to figure out what to do, and then get the number 3 so I can figure out what number I want to actually apply. So there's lots of ways to do this in Python. There's like 3 or 4 sort of valid ways of going about this, but most of them require using concepts and syntax that we haven't actually covered yet that we're going to go into more detail in the next module. So I'm going to try to use what's sort of a more basic version, which is going to lean more on the kinds of function work that we've already done. It's going to get a little bit dicey, but I think we'll still be able to make it work. Okay, so here's the idea, is we've got our response, and what we want to be able to do is we need to figure out I need to figure out the operation, right, add, and I need to figure out the value 3, which from our example there. So the way that we're going to need to do that is if you look at the string that we were given, this add 3, you'll notice that the thing between them, right, the place that we know that I'm done with the word add, I'm beginning the word 3, is actually the space. So if I can figure out where that space is, then I could say everything before the space is the command, and everything after the space is going to be the number. That space is going to act as a delimiter between these two different parts of the operation. So we can basically figure out, okay, well, where's that space so that I can use that as sort of my breaking point. Let's do that work. So we're going to be able to say, figure out the space location. If we take our response, we're able to call a function on it called find. And find is a string method, so similar to upper or lower starts with. This is a function that all strings support, and it's basically going to let you go looking through a string for a particular value, and then it'll tell you what index, which character number that string happens to be in. So I could say I'm interested in finding the space character, right? I'm going to put my quotation marks with a space between them because that's the letter I'm looking for. And what it will do is it will go to add 3, and it'll actually try to figure out which character number this guy is. It'll say, okay, we're going to start at 0, 1, 2, 3. So this is character number, we start at 0, but this is basically going to be sort of character number 3 or 4, depending on how you want to count these things. So that's going to be sort of the location, the index of where my space happens to be. We then need to figure out, well, how can I get all the string stuff before that space, and how can I get all the string stuff that comes after it? In order to do that, I'm going to give us a method that we got to use some syntax that's weird new syntax, and so I'm going to give ourselves define myself a new function that has that syntax, which we can ignore. So ignore this line of code, right? This is basically doing a bunch of weird stuff that we're going to cover in the next module, so just don't worry about that now. But what I'm basically going to do is I'm going to provide us a function called substring, which will get us a substring. We're going to pass in the string, what's the starting character number that we want to start getting our substrings from, and what's the ending character number, how far do we want to go. So that's going to be our function that we're going to want to use. But again, we're going to ignore that. I'm going to even hit the little arrow and collapse it so we don't even need to look at how it works. We're going to pretend that it's like a built-in provided function that we don't need to worry about any otherwise. Okay, cool. So what we can then do with that is now that we know where our space is, we can now say, well, then clearly our operation, the thing that I want to do, is going to be the substring, right, of my response. We're going to start at what's called 0, right, sort of the 0 at the beginning of my string, and we're going to end at the space location. So all that content is going to be my word add, in order to see what that works. And then similarly, the value is going to be my substring of my response, starting at the space location. And actually, we're going to want to add 1 to that because I actually want to move the next character over, because if we look at my number, I don't want to actually start right here where the cursor is. I want to start 1 space over, right where the blinking cursor is here. I want to start over at the 3. So we're going to go from that, and we're going to say go up until the end of the string, whatever that is, and we know that the number of characters, the number of letters that there might possibly be, is going to be the length of this response. So that'll be able to basically get us what we need to go. So the idea here is, again, we're going to find the space. We're going to say take the substring. It's going to be everything up into the space, and then we're going to take the substring of everything from the space to the end of the string, and that gives me my operation and my value. We can test that this works by, I'm going to comment out my return value, because I don't want to return anything at the moment, because I don't have a new value yet. But just to test things, right, this is to test things, I'm going to try printing out that the operation is the operation, and I'm going to try printing out that the value is the value. So that way I'll be able to see, am I actually getting the things that I cared about and the stuff that I expected. I can delete these notes. Well, I'll leave those notes there for now. So I've now sort of, to test things out, I've tried writing some printing. We can now actually try doing this do operation function. Look, which I've got there. I'm going to say get initial value, then I'm going to call do operation, passing that value, and then we should be able to see what we're getting. So we're going to save our work, right? I hit Control S, so you notice that my circle went away at the top. I'm going to go back to my my notebook here. I'll sort of go back to the top, and I'll say run our program. Our initial value, let's put in 5 as an initial value. We're then going to say add 3, because that's the command we're interested in giving. And notice it prints out that the operation was called add, and the value was 3, which looks exactly like I wanted. My final value is none, because currently I'm not returning anything from do operation, right? There is no return statement because it's got commented out, so it's returning a value none, thing that doesn't exist. But in any case, it looks like my figuring out what to do, my operation, my value, looks like it's working exactly as I hoped it would, which would make sense since I had tried this out ahead of time. All right. Whew. Good. So we got that part done, right? We've decided what command to do, and it looks like we've tested it out to make sure that it's working and it's doing the kinds of thing that we expect. All right, this is where I would normally, if I was giving this demo live, I would pause for questions, but this is a good time to sort of note, pause your video, make sure everything is good, that you're sort of clear on what's happening. If you have questions, let us know, send a message to us on it or something like that, and we'll be able to then clarify a particular step up to this point. Also, let me take a breath. Okay, cool. What's next? All right, so we got our operation, and we got some value. So now we need to get to the next step in my notes, and you'll notice how useful these notes are being, because they tell me what I need to do, is that we need to do some math to produce this new value. So the idea is I want to say, do that operation and take that value and do some math to my current value. So the basic idea is that being if the thing they typed in with the word add, I want to add these numbers together. If they typed in the word subtract, I'm going to subtract these numbers together. So this can sound like just a basic if block, right? We've done this kind of thing before, and that's going to work out okay. However, if we think about it, like I'm going to have to do a bunch of different ifs, right? It's going to be if add, if subtract, if multiply, if divide. There's maybe a bunch of work that's going to go on here. So I feel like rather than trying to do all those if works right here inside this do operation function, I think it might be a good idea to make myself a separate helper function that can do that kind of work. So this separate function I'm going to call calculate, because that's what we're going to do. We're going to calculate something. And the idea is that this is going to be a helper method. So the sort of idea is I'm going to be able to use this method, pass it in some variables, and have it do that extra work sort of on its side. It's almost like a little assistant function, which I can then have it return a value that my do operation function can use. The reason we're building up this helper function is it's going to help keep things more organized. It's going to help say like, okay, all the math happens right over here. I don't need to worry about the math over there where I was doing the string processing stuff. Ideally, we'd even be able to actually say take all this stuff and put it into its own function, except that we need two values at the end, and we can't actually ever return two values from, well, we can't return two values in Python the way we're doing things. So in any case, we're going to have our calculate function. So the things we want to be able to do is we're going to want to know that we're going to have what operation we want to use, right? Do we want to add, subtract, or divide? We're going to want to know and then we'll need to know what the two operations are, right? Is this going to effectively be number one? It's going to be number two. So this in this case would be our current value probably, and this would be like the new value, the 3 we want to add. But I'm going to write it in this way because this way it makes it more flexible. This will let me do calculations for all kinds of things if I want to, say, build a more complex calculator later. A lot of programming is about trying to figure out how we can develop things so that they might work in a more general sense in the future. All right, so let's keep going. All right, so this is going to work very simple, right? I might say if operation is add, then that means what I want to do is I want to take OP1 and add it to OP2, right? Take my two numbers, add them together, and then I'm going to return that result. Otherwise, if my operation is going to be subtract, then I would say return OP1 minus OP2, right? Now the order bring me out as a little bit. I'm looking at this, I'm like, okay, operation is equal to subtract. I'm going to just imagine that typing the word subtract over and over again is going to get really tedious. I may want to use something smaller like sub or maybe minus. There's sort of options here, but sub might fit me better. Like I want to sort of be able to say add sub. That sort of feels like that might be a little bit quicker, and it has that 3-character thing that feels a little bit better. So I could do something where I said elif operation is equal to subtract, or operation is equal to sub, right? I could try to handle both cases. However, that handles subtract and sub, but what if I also want to do subt or subtract, or maybe I want to just do an S? And there's lots of different ways I want to handle this. So what I actually recommend doing is rather than trying to handle each individual possible input case, we're going to try to let's use a function to do this work. We can look at the things that are the same about subtract and sub is that they both start with sub, or they even both start with S. So what we can do is we can actually do use the starts with function, which is going to return a Boolean, and we can actually say, well, let's see if this variable even just starts with sub. So that way, no matter what the user types, if they type the word subtract, if they misspell subtract, or they just type sub, it will still work, and we basically gain a lot of flexibility as long as we're while still being able to keep things to make sure they're not just typing random words in general. So I'm often going to recommend, rather than necessarily saying just comparing things to like add or subtract, particularly for user entered input, but we can use stuff like starts with in order to figure out what we want to, in order to figure out how we want to make this stuff work. This is going to basically give us a little bit more flexibility to do this kind of mathematical work, or at least to do this kind of user input handling work. I'm going to just paste in the others because this video is already going long, much longer than I hoped it would be. Do this, I need to fix my inputs, there we go. So I'm going to have my calculate function, that'll take in my operation, so add my two numbers, and then I'll be able to check if it starts with add, subtract, multiply, divide, and be able to do all those operations instead. I want to make sure that I have an else case here, because what happens if the operation is something I don't recognize, if I don't know what it is, if they typed in some word that it doesn't get matched, well then what I'll do is I'll just, because I want to return something, because I don't want my program to break, I'm just going to return whatever the first operand is and assume that if they type something out, then the second number doesn't end up mattering in some way. All right, cool. So we've got our calculate function that now takes in these three arguments that lets us do that kind of work. So if we go back to our do operation function, we can now do some math to produce that new value. So I'm going to call my calculate function that I just wrote. I'm going to pass it in that operation, right? The word add, because we know that's what they typed in. I'm going to pass in the current value as my first number, because that's what I want to start with. And then I'm going to pass in the inputted value, right? This guy, as my second number, because that's what I want to start with. And remember that calculate is going to return a value, which means that I need to then say that the result of doing that calculation is going to be stored in in a variable, right? That's going to be effectively, that's my new value, right? That's the thing that I want to return, right? That's my new value after doing this calculation. Oh, great. Look, now that I have that new value, I can actually go back and uncomment my return statement so that now I've got my completed do operation function, right? I'm going to say get the input, figure out what command we want to do that math work by calling one of my helper functions to keep these things organized, and then be able to return my new value. You'll notice that this function is actually fairly short on its own, even though it's doing a lot of complex work. And I'm able to keep it sort of well organized, so it really only feels like it's doing like 2 to 3 sort of small things, right? Input, run calculate. This piece is a little bit more complicated, but that's about all it's working on. Because I've broken it up into these separate functions, right, my calculator is doing all that complex work up here, this is able to stay pretty clean and simple and easy to read and easy to understand, and which is often our goal in writing programs, is we want something that's easy for people to be able to look at your code and understand what you're doing, but it's also easy for you to understand so that as you're writing it, you don't get totally stuck and confused about why you're trying to put these things together. All right, great. So I'm going to clear up my spaces here. I'm going to go back to, if we check my main again, I've got my values getting the initial value, my results, my do operation on that value, which should do all the work I expect, and I should be able to print out the final result. Let's go ahead and run it, see if it works. My initial value is going to be 5. I'm going to try to add 3. And it crashed. My string value has no attribute start with. So again, error happened, was the error. I was not expecting an error, but this is good because it shows what happens when you get errors. So we're going to look at the problem. Attribute error, str object, a string object, has no attribute start with. What that means is that I tried to access a property or a method on a string called start with, and it says that there is no such thing. You try to tell a string to do something it can't do. All right, well, I'm going to go back to where start with was, which is right there. And I'm going to stare at it for a moment and realize that, oh, I see. The method is not actually called start with. It's actually called starts with. And you'll notice that's what I did later down the line. So I'm going to make that typo. That's a typo. Everyone makes typos, and I make them live on video for you to see. Well, recorded video, whatever. So that didn't quite work. Let's try again. We're going to run our 10 key. My initial value will be 5. I'm going to add 3 for float and string. So where's the problem here? God, I'm trying to move too fast. That's fine. So in this case, we're trying to add numbers right there. We're trying to add some numbers. It's going to be a float and a string, which probably means that one of these values was a string. I know that OP1, my current value was a float, because I definitely said be a float up there. I'm going to guess that I forgot to turn my value here into a float as well. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to say take that substring thing that I did, which was confusing, and we're going to say make that whole thing into a float so that I know that value ends up being a float. All right, let's try it again. 5, add 3. Yay, look, it finally worked. Bugs happen, right? And we have to fix these things. And this is a normal sort of series of steps. But again, this is sort of going through what's that logic, what's that process going to look like? Where I said, okay, I wrote some code, I got a bug. I didn't immediately delete everything and start over again. I said, let's go look to see where's the likely source of that error. and then try to make a fix that adjusts that error and sort of adding in little pieces to be able to do one thing at a time. So this looks like it works, right? I can say initial value could be 5, and I can subtract 11, and that gives me -6. That sounds correct if you remember negative numbers. So this all seems like it's working great so far. This sounds actually really amazing. Right? It looks like we almost have our function. The piece I might notice is I say, great, here's my work that actually sort of does my actual like calculating work. That's feeling like that's beginning to get a little bit long, and I might want to reuse that somewhere else. So I might actually go ahead and make myself a new function to do that work as well. Maybe I'm going to make a use calculator function, and I'm just going to take this code. I'm going to cut it and paste it. That was Control-C paste. Up there, so I'm basically going to say do all the same code, but do it inside that function. So I basically have grouped it all. I basically sort of taken it out of like the center of my desk and moved it into its own little envelope to do its own kind of work. And then I can specify that I want to then call that function from my main block here in order to say do that same kind of work. So again, this is going to work exactly the same way. I can take 3 and I can add 5 to that. But now I've sort of, again, organized my code so that what my script is doing is my script is just saying use a calculator, and then the use calculator says, well, now we do these various steps where I take my initial value and pass them to do operation. Do operation then does some work, which includes passing things down to calculate. So I end up making these functions that call their functions, so that I'm building up this more complex program but I'm still at the same time only writing out small bits of code at a time as I go. Whew, okay, great. So we're almost there. 30 minutes in, that's okay. So now we're going to add in the trickiest part, which I'm going to show mostly as a demo because it will be useful for assignments later, and just because we want to like make sure we get something really snazzy at the end. But this is mostly cover what I want to talk about in terms of how functions work. But the basic idea is that what I want to do is currently I can add in a value, I can type in an operation or a form, and then it gives me the final value, and that's it. What I would like to be able to do is have this repeat. I would like to be able to type in 3 and then add 5, add 11, add 5, add 6. I want to be able to add in lots and lots of numbers and have it keep incrementing, keep adding in more and more data, and then be able to give me a final result at the very end of the whole thing. So what's that going to look like? The basic idea here is that I want to, inside my do operation work, right, after I calculate this new value, before I actually return and say, hey, I'm done, that's my new value, I'm all finished with it, what I'd like to be able to basically do is I want to say, okay, in addition, also do another operation. Right? Is I want to say, okay, great, let's calculate one new value, but then before we return it and say, I'm done doing my operation, I want to say, oh yeah, also I should prompt the user to say, hey, do you have any other inputs you want to provide? Do you want to do any other kind of work? So what we're going to then do is we want to say that before I return that value, I want to do another operation. I want to get another set of input and then do another piece of math. So because I have a function, do operation, that lets me do that kind of work, what I'm able to do is I can say, let's actually go ahead and call that function again. So I'm going to say that I want to do another operation. So I'm going to call my do operation function. I need to pass in something for it to be its current value, but remember that because I've calculated a new value off of my calculate function, this new value is actually now my new current value. So I actually want to pass that in as sort of my new starting value in order to say what number to add to. So I can pass in my new value of something else to add to, and then this whole thing is then going to end up getting me this new results, right? This new thing that I want to do. Right, this is now going to be sort of my second new value, as it were. So now that I have this second new value, what I can then do is say that that's the value that I want to then return, right? I want to say that after you finish doing this so after we've done an operation once, I've gone ahead and say, get my input, figure out what command to do, and then do the math. I want to say, okay, yeah, and also, by the way, now do it a second time, and then return the result of doing it twice. Now, the do second time is going to basically run this function again, so it's going to do these 3 steps, including the now do another time. So effectively, the second time is going to say, oh yeah, by the way, also do it a third time, and the third time will then say, oh yeah, by the way, also do it a 4th time, and this will basically cause it to repeat, to do this kind of work. This is a process called recursion. This is recursion. is the name of the operation, the function we're doing here. This is like one of the coolest, most powerful tools in computer programming, but it's also really complex. We're not going to do a lot of it, but this is basically a way that we can do this kind of repeating work using the syntax that we already have, just by keeping in mind that we are basically passing in new values and calling a function and then getting that return value again. All right, so let's see what this looks like when we actually run it, assuming it doesn't crash on me. My initial value is going to be 3. I'm going to add 5. Now you see how it's prompting me to go to say, so I added 5, right? That was this piece, this calculated piece. Now it's going to prompt me to do it again. There's my next input. So I can now say add 6. I can now say add 8. And you'll notice that it's just going to keep going because I don't have any way to tell it to stop. I'm going to hit Control and C in order to cancel out this program, in order to sort of tell it to stop and be done so that I can be able to try and make some other adjustments. But this is going to let us be able to then do all these different addition work. I'm going to add a new piece. I'm going to actually print out the second new value here. So I'm going to sort of print this out as intermediate feedback, just so we know. Actually, you know what? Oh, you know what would be a really slick way of doing it? Let's put it here. Let's do current value right before my prompt. How's that sound? Yeah. So if we do that, my initial value is 5. Uh-oh, what did I do wrong? Oops, sorry. Let's be a string. I can't use it. There we go. Let's do it like that. So my initial value can be 5, which says now my running total is 5.0. I can now say add 3. I now have an 8.0. I can now say subtract 2, multiply by 4, and I'm able to keep that going. Yeah? Yeah, it looks slick. I like it. All right, cancel to make everything go away. Clear to get rid of it. Okay, so the one thing we need to do is we need to have a way, finally the last piece we need is we need to have a way for it to be able to stop. So the basic idea is I think what I'd like to be able to do is I want to be able to say my initial value is 5, I want to say add 3, add 3, add 3. I feel like I'd like to be able to just hit enter, return, and have it, rather than crashing, saying that I can't convert that empty string into a float, I'd like to have it then say like, let's go ahead and stop at that one point. So we can do that, that's not too bad. We've done that before. This is the same kind of thing we did back up here at the top where I said check to see if my response was an empty string. So let's do the same thing down here. Let's check to see if my response is an empty string. And we'll say that if it's not an empty string, then I want to go ahead and do all of this work, right? I'm going to indent it all to say that if I'm not an empty string, then I should do all the things that I normally actually end up doing. But I'm also going to have an else. Right? Because what happens if it was an empty string? Well, if it was an empty string, I still need to return a value, right? Because I still want my do operation function that's used down here, it still needs to return a value that can get stored inside this result. So else, otherwise, I'm going to return a value. What should I return? Let's just return whatever that current value that was inputted was. So we'll just go ahead and say, like, if they basically say, if you say, what do you want to do? And they just hit enter, we'll say, great, I'm just going to give you back the number that you had to start with, which will then produce that result, which our final value can end up taking. All right, so try it out again. We should be all done at this point. So our initial value can be 5. We can add 11. We can subtract 3. I can divide by 2. I can multiply by 7. I can then add 6 to it, and I say, you know what, I'm done, and I can hit return, and it tells me my final value is 51.5. And we've now built ourselves a 10-key calculator, basically, right? A way that we can basically do a bunch of sort of ongoing calculation work on some kind of running total. Using really just the syntax and concepts we've covered so far, though there's been a couple of new pieces that we sort of introduced here because they're needed to make the demo work. But the important parts here, the stuff that you really want to take away, is the things to know from this video is how I was testing this program, right? How I sort of would run each individual function as I went. You'll notice I kept jumping back here. I kept running things again. I didn't try to write the entire thing and then test at the very end. If I got a bug, I went back and looked at individual pieces. I made small changes as I was going. We had this sort of very much sort of incremental, sort of step-by-step development process. We worked on one thing at a time, right? I was sort of working on one function and actually kept these functions in such a way that they're all small enough that each one fits on its own screen, or they're all sort of these small little pieces of stuff to work on. Changed small things as we went, as we decided how we wanted to adjust our content. I want to make sure that the part of the thing I mean by how functions get used and combined, how you compose them together, is this kind of process where I can then say take one function that returns a value, that value then becomes the input to another function that returns some value, That value then becomes the input to another function, even if it's a built-in one, so that we basically are sort of having like sort of input comes in here, comes out there, goes into here, comes out there, goes into here, comes out there. So we're basically producing this pipeline of interaction. And then we're also then able to combine these functions by using helper functions. So we can say, let's have one function call another, passing in some result, and basically have that helper function do some other assistance work so that we don't have to have one huge function that does all of our work at once. The general goal here is we're trying to make these functions be standalone systems. We want each function to take in the arguments it needs, take in only the information it needs, do all that work, and then produce a result for someone else to use. So each one of these functions stands on its own. They don't depend on any of the others, except for the ones that they call. They can sort of, each one is its own little individual unique thing, which means that I can then test and write and practice with each one of these individually without having to worry about the entire thing altogether. So that's sort of the general idea about how you would go about writing a function. In the end, we build ourselves a calculator. It's 50 lines of code, but all of these are concepts and structures that we've generally seen before in order to be able to make this whole thing work. And that's the general process. This process can take some practice. It takes some time. I want to give you a demo so you can see how that works. You'll practice it a bit with the ed exercise and with the assignments. As always, if you get stuck or you need some help, please reach out and let us know. I'll also include a copy of this in this completed code in ed so you'll be able to then see what the whole thing looks like if you want to then reference this again later. Great, thanks.